Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your neighbor's pig has been arrested for murder. A dead pope is standing trial before a courtroom full of judges, and wearing the wrong color shirt could cost you your entire fortune. It sounds like satire written by someone trying too hard to make history entertaining. Yet many of these astonishing stories emerged from real legal records preserved across medieval Europe. The greatest misconception about the Middle Ages is not that people lacked intelligence, but that their world operated according to a completely different understanding of order, morality, and justice. Modern society often separates law from religion, science from superstition, and economics from everyday life. Medieval Europe blurred all of these boundaries into a single system, where the spiritual and the practical constantly overlapped. To modern eyes, many of these rules appear absurd, yet they often reveal surprisingly logical foundations once viewed through the mindset of their own time. If a community believed divine punishment could fall upon everyone because of one person's sin, then holding a corpse accountable or prosecuting an animal was not irrational, but an attempt to restore cosmic balance. Law was never simply about punishing individuals. It was about protecting the moral structure of the entire community. This perspective changes how we should judge medieval society. Rather than dismissing these customs as evidence of ignorance, they demonstrate how deeply people believed that every action influenced both earthly survival and eternal destiny. A courtroom became not merely a place of legal judgment, but a stage where visible justice reassured invisible spiritual forces. Even the strangest rituals carried symbolic meaning that reinforced social stability in uncertain times. The same principle extended into ordinary daily life. Clothing identified social rank, church attendance reinforced communal identity, food regulations expressed religious obedience, and countless small rules reminded every individual exactly where they belonged within society's carefully ordered hierarchy. Freedom existed, but it operated inside boundaries established by tradition rather than personal choice. To break those boundaries threatened more than authority. It threatened the entire worldview holding medieval civilization together. Perhaps that is why these laws fascinate us today. They reveal not simply bizarre customs, but a radically different way of understanding reality itself. Throughout this journey, we will encounter talking bees, legal battles fought with swords, doctors forbidden to perform surgery, orphan children treated as property, and criminals escaping execution simply because they could read a Bible verse. Each story seems unbelievable in isolation, yet together they paint a remarkable portrait of a civilization struggling to impose order upon a dangerous world where famine, disease, war, and uncertainty were constant companions. Once we stop laughing at these strange laws and begin asking why they existed, the Middle Ages become less mysterious and far more human. Behind every unusual rule stood ordinary people trying to solve extraordinary problems with the knowledge available to them. Their solutions may seem strange today, but centuries from now our own legal systems may appear equally incomprehensible to future generations looking back at us with the same mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Modern courts are built upon a simple assumption: justice applies only to the living. Once a person dies, legal responsibility ends, history takes over, and memory becomes the final judge. Medieval Europe saw the world very differently. In an age where the fate of the soul mattered as much as the fate of the body, death was not always considered the end of accountability. A person's reputation could continue affecting the living long after burial, and that belief gave rise to one of history's most astonishing legal traditions, the trial of the dead. To modern observers, the idea seems almost impossible to comprehend. How could judges question a corpse? How could lawyers defend someone incapable of speaking? Yet for medieval society, these ceremonies were less about collecting evidence than restoring moral order. Communities believed that unresolved wrongdoing could stain both institutions and future generations. Publicly condemning or vindicating the deceased became a symbolic act demonstrating that justice, unlike human life, never expired. The famous posthumous trial of a pope has become one of history's most bizarre episodes, but its significance reaches beyond shock value. It illustrates how politics and religion were inseparable. Removing honor from a dead leader weakened the legitimacy of his supporters while strengthening the authority of those now in power. In other words, the courtroom became an extension of political conflict, and even the grave could not guarantee neutrality. Modern societies rewrite history through books, speeches, and media narratives. Medieval rulers sometimes rewrote it through legal rituals performed before crowds of witnesses. This obsession with symbolic justice also reflected a world deeply concerned with collective responsibility. Communities feared that hidden sins might invite divine punishment upon everyone, making public acts of correction spiritually necessary. A dead criminal's disgrace reassured neighbors that order had been restored before God as well as before the law. While modern legal systems emphasize individual rights, medieval justice often prioritized communal stability above personal dignity. The difference reveals not stupidity but fundamentally different assumptions about society itself. Even burial practices reflected these beliefs. The location of a grave, the rituals surrounding death, and the treatment of the body carried profound social and religious meaning. To deny proper burial or publicly dishonor remains was to extend punishment beyond earthly existence into eternal memory. Reputation became almost a second body, one capable of surviving long after flesh disappeared. Perhaps this explains why medieval people invested such enormous emotional energy into public ceremonies. They believed symbols possessed genuine power to shape reality. Looking back from the 21st century, it is tempting to dismiss these practices as irrational superstition. Yet modern societies continue to remove statues, rename institutions, and debate the legacy of controversial historical figures. We still struggle over how the dead should be remembered because memory influences identity, and identity shapes the future. The methods have changed, but the underlying human impulse remains remarkably familiar. Medieval corpse trials, therefore, reveal something surprisingly universal. People across every age seek ways to reconcile the past with the values of the present. Their courtroom simply looked stranger than ours, reminding us that history's most bizarre customs often emerge from concerns we still share today, even if we express them in entirely different ways. One of the fastest ways to misunderstand the medieval world is to assume that its legal system functioned like ours with a few primitive limitations. In reality, it operated according to an entirely different philosophy, one where maintaining cosmic order sometimes mattered more than identifying rational responsibility. This strange logic reached its most astonishing expression when the accused was not a human being at all but a pig, a horse, a bull, or even a colony of insects. To modern audiences, the idea sounds almost comical. A courtroom filled with judges debating the guilt of a farm animal feels more like a scene from a fantasy novel than a page from legal history. Yet these proceedings reveal something profound about medieval society. People believed law existed to restore harmony, not merely to punish intention. Consider the terrifying reality of village life. A single animal attack could destroy an entire family, leaving parents without children or communities living in fear. Simply killing the offending creature might remove the danger, but conducting a formal trial transformed an act of necessity into an act of justice. Public hearings reassured the population that order had been restored through legitimate authority rather than emotional revenge. The ceremony itself became part of healing the community. This perspective also explains why defense attorneys occasionally represented animal defendants with remarkable seriousness. Some argued that beasts lacked moral understanding and therefore could not truly commit crimes. Others claimed poor supervision by owners contributed more to tragedy than the animal's own nature. Surprisingly, these arguments resemble modern legal discussions about criminal intent, diminished responsibility, and negligence. The language has changed, but the philosophical questions remain surprisingly familiar. Medieval lawyers were unknowingly wrestling with issues that legal scholars still debate centuries later. Even stranger were the cases involving insects devastating crops. Entire swarms could receive official summons ordering them to leave farmland under threat of divine and legal judgment. To modern observers, such proceedings seem pointless because insects cannot understand legal orders. Yet symbolic action mattered enormously in a deeply religious society. The court demonstrated that every available earthly remedy had been attempted before leaving the outcome in God's hands. Law, faith, and agriculture became intertwined within a single ritual designed to reassure communities facing forces they could barely control. Looking deeper, these animal trials reveal humanity's enduring need to assign meaning to catastrophe. Whenever tragedy strikes, people instinctively search for accountability. We investigate accidents, hold public inquiries, establish commissions, and demand explanations even when events result from random misfortune. Medieval courts expressed that same psychological impulse through different methods. They created structured responses to chaos because uncertainty itself can be more frightening than punishment. The legal ritual offered emotional certainty, where practical certainty remained impossible. There is also an unexpected lesson about the evolution of justice. Over time, legal systems gradually shifted attention from symbolic restoration toward evidence, intent, and individual rights. That transformation did not occur because earlier generations were foolish, but because societies continuously redefine what fairness means as knowledge expands. Medieval courts reflected the intellectual tools available to their age just as modern courts reflect ours. Future generations may well view some of our own legal practices with equal astonishment. History repeatedly reminds us that certainty is temporary, while understanding continues to evolve. The image of a pig standing before a judge, therefore, becomes more than an amusing historical curiosity. It symbolizes humanity's endless attempt to impose order upon a world where tragedy often arrives without explanation. Behind the apparent absurdity lies a timeless desire shared across every civilization, the hope that justice, however imperfectly understood, can restore balance after chaos has shattered ordinary life. Imagine walking through the marketplace wearing a beautiful crimson cloak you spent years saving to buy, only to have government officials stop you, confiscate the garment, and fine you simply because your family was born into the wrong social class. To modern minds, fashion is often a matter of personal taste or economic ability, but in medieval Europe clothing functioned as a legal language that instantly announced your place within society. Every color, fabric, trim, and decoration communicated status, profession, wealth, and even moral expectations. Changing that visual language threatened an entire social system built upon hierarchy. The authorities did not fear expensive clothing because it was luxurious. They feared it because it blurred the boundaries separating nobles from merchants and peasants. Medieval civilization depended upon everyone immediately recognizing who possessed authority. If appearance became unreliable, respect for rank might weaken, and with it the political order itself. This explains why governments invested extraordinary effort policing wardrobes. Officials patrolled markets, festivals, and public celebrations with powers to inspect garments, seize prohibited fabrics, and impose severe financial penalties. The existence of dedicated clothing inspectors may seem absurd today, yet it reflected an age where appearance carried legal significance almost equal to identity documents in the modern world. Looking deeper, these regulations reveal an economy driven by symbolism as much as commerce. Certain dyes required rare ingredients imported across continents, making brilliant colors astonishingly expensive. A rich purple cloak or scarlet robe represented access to global trade networks and immense financial resources. Restricting such materials to the elite transformed luxury goods into political tools, reinforcing visible inequality. Every public street became a carefully staged performance where society displayed itself according to officially approved rules. The medieval city was not merely inhabited, it was choreographed. Interestingly, these laws also expose a timeless tension between aspiration and authority. Throughout history, ordinary people have imitated the lifestyles of elites whenever opportunity allowed, while ruling classes repeatedly created new markers of exclusivity. Expensive clothing, private clubs, luxury brands, exclusive neighborhoods, and elite education all serve similar social functions across different centuries. The materials change, but the human desire to distinguish status remains remarkably constant. Medieval fashion laws therefore appear less alien when viewed through this broader lens. They simply enforce distinctions with legal force rather than market pressure alone. Yet no amount of regulation could completely suppress ambition. Wealthy merchants accumulated fortunes rivaling old aristocratic families and naturally wished their appearance to reflect their success. Every fine became, in effect, the price of challenging established hierarchy. Some gladly paid it because public display generated prestige worth more than the financial penalty itself. The law unintentionally created one of history's earliest examples of luxury consumption as social protest. Clothing became an argument stitched into fabric. There is another fascinating lesson hidden within these forgotten regulations. Governments often attempt to preserve existing social structures by controlling visible symbols, believing that managing appearances will protect deeper institutions. History repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. Economic change eventually reshapes society regardless of dress codes, titles, or ceremonial distinctions. Merchants became powerful because commerce expanded, not because they wore noble colors. The law could delay transformation but not prevent it forever. In the end, medieval wardrobes tell a surprisingly modern story about identity, ambition, inequality, and the endless negotiation between personal expression and collective order. A cloak was never just a cloak. It was a political statement visible from across the marketplace, reminding everyone that in the Middle Ages even getting dressed could become an act with legal consequences. Modern people often think of home as the ultimate symbol of independence. Close the front door, and what happens inside is largely your own business. Medieval peasants would have found that idea almost unimaginable. In many parts of Europe, even the simplest daily activities were controlled by obligations owed to a local lord, the church, or the crown. One of the most revealing examples involved something as ordinary as turning grain into flour. Today, buying a bag of flour requires little thought. In the Middle Ages, grinding wheat could become a legal issue capable of costing an entire family's livelihood. Under the feudal system, many lords possessed what historians call banal rights, granting them exclusive control over mills, ovens, and wine presses. Peasants were legally required to use these facilities and pay fees every time they processed their harvest. On the surface, this looked like a business arrangement. In reality, it functioned as a carefully designed economic monopoly that ensured wealth continually flowed upward through society. Every loaf of bread carried a hidden tax long before it reached the table. The remarkable part is not that such monopolies existed, but that people developed creative ways to resist them. Families secretly hid hand mills inside cottages, grinding grain at night beneath blankets to muffle the sound of stone scraping against stone. It was an act that seems almost absurd from a modern perspective, yet for a struggling household the difference between paying milling fees and keeping that grain could determine whether children survived the winter. Quietly crushing wheat became an act of economic rebellion. Every turn of the hidden stone represented a small challenge to feudal authority. Authorities responded with determination because they understood what was truly at stake. If enough peasants ignored the lord's mill, the financial foundation supporting local power would begin to erode. Officials searched homes, confiscated illegal grinding stones, and imposed devastating penalties, not because flour itself threatened society, but because independent production weakened dependence on the ruling class. The conflict reveals a recurring pattern throughout history. Whoever controls essential infrastructure often controls the people who rely upon it. Whether mills, railroads, electricity, or digital platforms, access to basic services creates influence extending far beyond economics. There is a fascinating psychological dimension hidden within these disputes as well. Medieval peasants lived with constant reminders that ordinary activities required permission from someone else. Bake bread, hunt in the forest, fish in certain waters, gather timber, or grind grain, and invisible legal boundaries surrounded each action. Such restrictions shaped not only behavior but identity itself. Freedom was measured less by personal rights than by inherited obligations tied to land and status. The contrast with modern concepts of citizenship highlights just how dramatically ideas of liberty have evolved over the centuries. Yet the story should not be reduced to simple oppression. Lords often maintained mills, roads, and infrastructure requiring substantial investment, and compulsory usage helped finance their upkeep. The system emerged from practical realities even as it generated resentment. History rarely divides neatly into villains and victims. Institutions frequently solve one problem while creating another, and medieval milling laws illustrate that complexity perfectly. Looking beyond the Middle Ages, the hidden mill becomes a symbol of humanity's ongoing struggle between centralized control and individual independence. Every generation debates who should own essential resources and how much freedom ordinary people should possess in providing for themselves. The arguments change form, but the underlying questions remain remarkably familiar. Somewhere in the quiet sound of a peasant secretly grinding grain beneath blankets lies an echo of every later movement seeking greater economic freedom, proving that even the smallest acts of daily life can become powerful expressions of human dignity. To understand medieval Europe, one must first understand that religion was not simply something people practiced on certain days of the week. It shaped law, economics, education, politics, and nearly every decision an ordinary person made from sunrise until bedtime. The church was not merely a place of worship. It was the center of community life, the keeper of records, the moral authority, and often the most powerful institution in existence. Because of this immense influence, behavior inside religious spaces carried consequences that extended far beyond personal faith. What modern society might dismiss as poor manners could become a public offense with lasting social repercussions. Imagine entering a village church after a week of exhausting physical labor. You have worked fields from dawn until dusk, survived poor harvests, worried about disease, and carried responsibilities few modern people can imagine. The priest begins a sermon lasting hours, spoken entirely in Latin that many listeners barely understand. Fatigue slowly overtakes you, your eyes close for a moment, and suddenly a sharp wooden pole taps your shoulder from across the room. A church warden has noticed your sleep and reminds you that even exhaustion must yield to discipline before God. To us, this appears almost humorous. To medieval society, it reflected the belief that worship was not optional entertainment, but a public obligation essential for the well-being of the entire community. Every person present reinforced the collective relationship between humanity and the divine. Disruptions threatened more than ceremony. They challenged social harmony itself. Laughing, whispering, arguing, or creating disorder inside sacred space could therefore be interpreted as disrespect toward both God and neighbor. Public punishment reinforced this message by demonstrating that communal values outweighed individual convenience. Even more revealing is the enormous practical power exercised through religious sanctions. Excommunication was not merely a spiritual declaration, but a form of social isolation with devastating economic effects. If merchants refused to trade with you, neighbors feared association, and community events excluded your family, daily survival became nearly impossible. Religion and commerce intertwined so completely that spiritual discipline functioned as an instrument of civil governance. In many respects, the church possessed influence comparable to a combined court system, educational institution, welfare network, and moral authority all at once. Such concentration of power inevitably shaped every aspect of ordinary existence. Yet behind these strict expectations lies an important historical reality. Medieval communities lacked the centralized governments, police forces, and bureaucracies familiar today. Social cohesion depended heavily upon shared rituals, bringing people together under common values. Weekly worship reinforced identity, transmitted information, settled disputes, and strengthened cooperation among neighbors whose survival often depended upon one another during famine or conflict. Attendance, therefore, served practical as well as spiritual purposes. Looking through this lens, the church functioned as one of history's earliest mechanisms for maintaining social capital. There is also an enduring lesson hidden beneath these ancient customs. Every society establishes public spaces where certain behaviors symbolize respect for shared institutions. Courtrooms require silence, schools enforce discipline, memorials invite reflection, and national ceremonies encourage collective participation. While the rules differ across cultures and centuries, the underlying principle remains recognizable. Communities express their values through rituals governing public conduct. Medieval churches simply represented one of the clearest examples of this universal human tendency. As strange as their punishments may appear today, they remind us that civilization has always depended upon unwritten agreements about how individuals should behave when gathered together. Those agreements evolve over time, but the need for them never truly disappears. In the quiet echo of a wooden waking stick striking a sleeping parishioner lies a deeper truth about history itself. Societies preserve order not only through laws but through countless shared expectations that teach each generation what it means to belong. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval society is that many actions we would now classify as folklore or harmless tradition carried genuine legal and social weight. The line separating superstition from official responsibility was often so blurred that ordinary people barely distinguished between the two. In their world, nature, religion, and law existed within the same invisible framework, each reinforcing the other. This explains why a beekeeper might gather his family around a hive after the death of its owner, knock gently on the wooden frame, and solemnly inform thousands of insects that their master had passed away. To modern ears, the ritual sounds charmingly eccentric. To medieval communities, failing to perform it risked economic disaster and spiritual disorder alike. Bees occupied a surprisingly important place within medieval civilization. Their honey sweetened food in an age before refined sugar became widespread, while beeswax illuminated churches, monasteries, and castles through countless candles that burned during religious ceremonies. Entire communities depended upon healthy hives. When something valuable appears mysterious, human beings naturally surround it with ritual. Over generations, practical observation merged with symbolic belief, until caring for bees involved not only farming but ceremony. If a colony abandoned its hive after the owner's death, people interpreted the event as confirmation that the neglected ritual had caused the loss, reinforcing traditions through coincidence rather than scientific understanding. Looking deeper, these customs reveal how medieval people attempted to create stability in an unpredictable environment. Crop failures, disease, harsh winters, and sudden death could strike without warning. Rituals provided a sense of participation in forces otherwise beyond human control. Informing bees of a funeral or placing black cloth over hives may not have altered nature, but it gave grieving families a meaningful action during moments of helplessness. Modern psychology recognizes similar patterns today. People preserve lucky objects, follow personal routines before important events, or observe symbolic gestures after loss because rituals create emotional order amid uncertainty. The medieval mind was not uniquely irrational. It simply expressed universal human instincts through different cultural forms. This same blend of symbolism and practicality appeared throughout daily life. Farmers watched birds for signs of weather. Sailors interpreted unusual waves as warnings, and villagers believed natural events reflected divine favor or displeasure. These ideas influenced decisions affecting harvests, trade, and community relations. Law often absorbed such beliefs because legislators emerged from the same cultural environment as everyone else. Rather than separating evidence from tradition, as modern institutions attempt to do, medieval authorities frequently integrated inherited customs into official expectations. The result was a legal culture where ceremony itself became a form of governance. There is an important cautionary lesson hidden within these stories. Every civilization possesses assumptions so deeply embedded that contemporaries rarely question them. Medieval people accepted conversations with bees because the practice fit naturally within their worldview. Modern societies likewise hold beliefs about economics, technology, politics, or social organization that future generations may regard with equal astonishment. History encourages humility by reminding us that certainty often reflects cultural context more than objective truth. The beekeeper whispering to his hive, therefore, deserves neither ridicule nor blind admiration. He represents humanity's enduring desire to build relationships with a world that often feels unpredictable and indifferent. In speaking to creatures incapable of answering, he affirmed a deeper conviction that every part of creation remained connected through invisible bonds. Whether interpreted as superstition, symbolism, or emotional wisdom, the ritual reminds us that history is filled with practices which appear strange only because we no longer inhabit the world that once made them perfectly reasonable. Imagine arriving at a medieval inn after days of traveling through forests filled with bandits, muddy roads, and dangerous river crossings. Your horse is exhausted, your clothes are soaked, and the small pouch of silver hanging from your belt represents months of hard-earned income. You finally reach safety, rent a room, and fall asleep believing your journey's dangers are behind you. By morning, your money has disappeared. In today's world, the hotel manager might apologize, offer sympathy, and tell you to contact your insurance provider. In much of medieval Europe, however, the law reached a very different conclusion. The innkeeper himself could be held financially responsible for your loss, regardless of whether he personally committed the theft. This remarkable legal principle reveals an unexpectedly sophisticated understanding of commercial trust long before modern banking or insurance systems existed. Medieval economies depended heavily upon merchants willing to travel between distant towns carrying valuable goods and currency. If travelers believed inns were unsafe, trade would slow dramatically, harming entire regions. Governments and courts therefore created powerful incentives for innkeepers to protect guests. Hospitality became more than good manners. It became a legally enforceable public responsibility. By placing financial risk on the owner rather than the traveler, lawmakers encouraged constant vigilance. Guards patrolled hallways, doors were reinforced, suspicious strangers received close attention, and dishonest employees faced severe punishment. The system transformed every inn into a private security operation because negligence directly threatened the owner's livelihood. Looking deeper, this arrangement demonstrates an important principle that continues shaping modern economics. Successful markets require trust. Buyers must believe sellers will honor agreements, investors must trust institutions, and travelers must trust accommodations. Whenever confidence disappears, commerce suffers. Medieval lawmakers understood this instinctively, even if they lacked the vocabulary of modern economics. They recognized that assigning responsibility to those best positioned to prevent harm creates incentives benefiting society as a whole. In many respects, these hospitality laws anticipated ideas later formalized through insurance contracts, consumer protection regulations, and professional liability standards. The parallels are striking. Another fascinating consequence was the extraordinary suspicion surrounding theft inside inns. Owners questioned servants carefully, monitored stables, locked storage rooms, and sometimes demanded valuables be declared upon arrival. While these measures could feel intrusive, They reflected the harsh reality that one successful robbery might bankrupt a small establishment. Travelers purchased not only a bed, but also the innkeeper's reputation. A trustworthy host attracted future customers, while rumors of insecurity spread rapidly across merchant networks. Reputation itself became valuable capital, demonstrating once again that invisible assets often prove more important than physical property. Yet medieval hospitality also carried profound cultural significance beyond economics. Offering shelter to strangers possessed religious importance rooted in traditions encouraging charity toward travelers and pilgrims. Protecting guests, therefore, became both moral duty and legal obligation. Violating that trust offended society as well as God. In a fragmented world where journeys remained dangerous and communication slow, the promise of safe lodging represented one of civilization's most essential guarantees. Without it, long-distance trade, diplomacy, scholarship, and pilgrimage would have become vastly more difficult. There is an enduring lesson hidden inside these forgotten laws. Every thriving society depends upon institutions willing to accept responsibility rather than simply deny it when problems occur. Trust grows where accountability exists. Whether managing medieval inns or modern financial systems, confidence flourishes when those entrusted with public welfare bear meaningful consequences for failure. Looking back across 7 centuries, the weary traveler entering a roadside inn sought exactly what people still seek today. The hope that someone else's promise of safety can be trusted enough to close one's eyes and sleep peacefully. That simple expectation has always been one of civilization's greatest achievements, proving that security is often built not by walls alone, but by laws encouraging people to protect one another. In today's world, the ability to read is so common that most people rarely stop to appreciate its value. It opens doors to education, careers, and entertainment, but few imagine that reading a single paragraph aloud could mean the difference between life and death. Yet for centuries in medieval Europe, literacy possessed a legal power almost unimaginable by modern standards. Under a remarkable legal privilege later known as the benefit of clergy, an accused criminal who could successfully recite a passage from Scripture might escape the executioner's blade. It sounds like a loophole from a work of fiction, but it reflected one of the most fascinating intersections between religion, education, and justice in medieval society. The origins of this privilege were understandable enough. Clergymen belonged to ecclesiastical courts rather than secular ones, and the church insisted that its members be judged according to canon law. Because literacy was largely concentrated among priests and monks, the ability to read gradually became a practical method of identifying those entitled to special jurisdiction. Over time, however, reality complicated the system. Literacy slowly expanded beyond monasteries into towns and universities, while legal traditions failed to evolve as quickly. What began as protection for the clergy transformed into an unexpected escape route for educated laymen. In effect, knowledge itself became a shield more effective than armor. The unintended consequences were extraordinary. Prisoners memorized specific Bible verses without understanding the rest of the text, hoping to convince judges they possessed genuine literacy. Courtrooms repeatedly heard the same psalm recited by desperate defendants whose lives depended upon flawless pronunciation. Authorities soon realized many accused individuals had learned a single passage purely for legal survival rather than religious devotion. The system adapted by branding offenders who successfully claimed the privilege, ensuring they could not exploit it twice. Even then, the law reveals an astonishing truth. Medieval society considered education not merely a skill, but evidence of belonging to a fundamentally different social category deserving different treatment. Looking beyond its legal mechanics, this custom exposes the immense prestige attached to knowledge during an age when books were copied by hand and libraries represented fortunes. Literacy remained rare because acquiring it demanded years of training unavailable to most ordinary people. A person able to read possessed access to law, theology, administration, and political influence. In many respects, written language functioned as a technology separating elites from the majority of the population. The privilege granted to readers, therefore, reflected broader assumptions linking education with moral character and institutional trust. Whether those assumptions were justified is another question entirely. This remarkable legal loophole also invites reflection upon modern society. Today, education still shapes opportunity, though in subtler ways. Access to quality schools, legal representation, financial knowledge, and digital literacy often determines outcomes invisible to those already possessing such advantages. The medieval courtroom where reading could save a criminal's life exaggerates a pattern that continues in different forms. Knowledge changes destiny. While no modern judge asks defendants to recite scripture before sentencing, educational inequality continues influencing careers, income, health, and social mobility across the world. The principle remains familiar even as the ritual disappears. There is a deeper philosophical lesson hidden beneath this peculiar law. Civilization advances not only through stronger institutions, but through wider access to knowledge. Every time literacy spread beyond narrow elites, societies became more dynamic, innovative, and ultimately more equal before the law. The benefit of clergy unintentionally highlighted the immense power contained within words written on parchment. A few memorized lines could overturn a death sentence because ideas possess extraordinary authority once societies choose to honor them. Looking back, perhaps the strangest aspect is not that reading saved lives, but that for so much of history, the ability to read was considered exceptional at all. The medieval courtroom reminds us that every page we casually turn today represents a privilege generations before us could scarcely imagine, proving that knowledge has always been one of humanity's most valuable forms of protection. Looking back across hundreds of years of medieval law, it is tempting to laugh at the strange customs, impossible regulations, and bizarre punishments that governed everyday life. We smile at pigs standing before judges, bees being informed of funerals, clothing inspectors measuring sleeves, and criminals escaping death by reciting a single Bible verse. Yet beneath these extraordinary stories lies a much deeper truth. The medieval legal system was not designed merely to punish crime. It was designed to preserve order in a world where almost everything else felt uncertain. Famine could destroy an entire harvest overnight. Disease could erase half a village before winter ended. Kings died unexpectedly, wars erupted without warning, and scientific explanations for natural disasters simply did not exist. In such an environment, stability became humanity's most precious resource, and law evolved into a tool for defending that stability by regulating nearly every aspect of life. This explains why medieval governments cared about clothing, bread, forests, language, gambling, occupations, and even funeral rituals. Every visible rule reinforced an invisible message. Society survives only when everyone knows their place and follows the accepted order. The system often sacrificed individual freedom in exchange for collective predictability. Whether that bargain was just remains open to debate, but its logic becomes easier to understand when viewed through the constant fear that surrounded medieval existence. Ironically, many of these strange regulations reveal remarkable administrative sophistication. Inspectors monitored markets, standardized weights, licensed professions, protected consumers, regulated trade, and enforced public health long before modern governments developed specialized agencies. Behind the apparent absurdity existed an emerging bureaucracy attempting to solve practical problems with limited knowledge and limited technology. Medieval officials were not fools wandering blindly through superstition. They were administrators trying to govern extraordinarily difficult societies using the intellectual tools available to them. Their failures and successes alike contributed to the gradual evolution of modern legal institutions. Another fascinating lesson emerges when we compare medieval law with our own world. Every generation believes its legal system reflects common sense, while previous generations appear hopelessly misguided. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that laws evolve alongside culture. Practices once considered unquestionable later become shocking, while ideas once dismissed as radical eventually become ordinary. Medieval Europe reminds us that justice is never fixed. It is a living conversation between values, knowledge, politics, economics, and human experience. Future historians may examine some of our own legal practices with the same astonishment we reserve for corpse trials and animal prosecutions today. That realization should encourage humility rather than superiority. There is also something profoundly human connecting all these stories. Whether speaking to bees, prosecuting pigs, regulating colors, or protecting travelers, medieval people sought the same goals modern societies pursue: safety, fairness, identity, prosperity, and social stability. Their methods reflected the realities of their age just as ours reflect the realities of ours. Technology changes, institutions evolve, but the desire to create predictable rules for living together remains one of civilization's oldest ambitions. Perhaps the greatest surprise hidden within medieval law is not how different those people were from us, but how familiar they become once we understand the fears driving their decisions. In the end, the strangest laws of the Middle Ages reveal less about medieval irrationality than about humanity's endless search for order in a chaotic world. Every bizarre courtroom ritual, every impossible regulation, every symbolic punishment represented another attempt to impose meaning where uncertainty threatened survival. And perhaps centuries from now, future generations will study our own legal systems with equal fascination, wondering why we believed our rules made perfect sense while unknowingly creating traditions that history would one day consider just as extraordinary. The bizarre laws of medieval Europe were not random acts of madness, but reflections of a society struggling to create order in an uncertain world. They remind us that every legal system is shaped by its culture, fears, beliefs, and technology. Understanding the past with empathy rather than mockery helps us recognize that our own societies, common sense, may one day appear just as strange to future generations.